I want to know also, as an historian, what do you think is the most important omitted context for understanding where we are today? In other words, what do the American people need to know that would shape the way they understand the current moment?
Most people in most of the world
Yeah,
have a
that's
far
true.
better
Right.
understanding of
That is
what's
true.
going on because they're not disserved by a lying media,
Right.
which
Propagandized.
which they get distorted views, I'm sure, in much of the world. But on this issue, they have a clearer view of this, I think,
Yeah.
and they're not shielded from reality the way Israelis and many Europeans and many Americans are. I think that there are a couple of key things. Things are seen from an Israeli perspective. I mean, if you read a New York Times article, first of all, nobody's allowed to get into Gaza. The Israelis won't let you in. So you can't report from Gaza. They have local stringers who, of course, are Arabs. And of course, we can't trust anything an Arab says. Of course, these are just stringers. These are not, reporters for the New York Times. These are not CNN reporter XYZ. No, some dude speaking in an Arabic accent, completely dismissed. So that's the first thing. Things everything is framed as Israel sees it, or in terms of how it affects Israel. You read the New York Times, and you sometimes think you're reading the Tel Aviv Times. The perspective is an Israeli perspective. The second thing is it's a perspective of power, and by that I mean the power of the U.S. state. Admiral Kirby's pronouncements, or Jake Sullivan's pronouncements, or whatever it may be, are given prominence. They're never critiqued. They're never criticized. This is clearly untrue. You wouldn't say that of something that the spokesman for the National Security Council says when it is manifestly untrue, or at least challengeable or critiquable. Whereas something that Hamas says, well, this is a Hamas spokesman.
Right.
If it's included, it's dismissed. Israeli casualties. Whatever Israel says about its casualties and about it's just reported as it is. Whereas we're always told, well, we have to watch out because this is the Hamas Health Service or Hamas government, whatever. So I think that that perspective of power and seeing things from an Israeli perspective it infects the entirety of the American and to a very large extent, I would say, the Western European media. It's being challenged from within. Every time I talk to younger journalists, they tell me the battles they have with their producers, with their editors, with the managers, with the owners of the media that they work for. We've seen articles about how MSNBC has been censored and challenged from its corporate owner. I talk to journalists all the time. I talked to a journalist in the New York Post who told me I couldn't write stuff because I mean, the New York Murdoch paper. So I think there's a whole set of levels. Fortunately, younger people who watch things like your podcast or other alternative media or on social media have a range of views which are simply inaccessible via the mainstream corporate media. Or if they're accessible, they're typed and boxed in such a way that well, this is what they say, but this is what we say. And so they don't believe a thing. In fact, I used to ask students 20 years ago about something I'd seen in the New York Times, and in a large class of a couple hundred people, 50 or 20 or 30 would nod their heads. They'd seen the article. Nobody has seen an article in the New York Times today. If I mention something I've seen in the Times, nobody knows what I'm talking about. They wouldn't believe the New York Times for a second. They pay no attention to it, nor to CNN, nor to MSNBC. So I think that that's a real problem for the elite. They own and control this media, the same kind of people who own and control our politicians, the same kind of people who own and control corporations and are on the boards of trustees of museums and art galleries and universities. But they don't own and control the media that most young people get their information from. And that's driving them crazy. That's one reason we're going to see a ban on TikTok, perhaps.
Right.
Stand the idea that there's some alternative view. Of course, it's Russian or it's Chinese or whatever.
Right.
And there are other things too.
Yeah, I mean, but Jonathan Greenblatt, right, talked about Israel's TikTok problem,
Right.
famously,
Exactly.
and leaked audio where he also admitted that we have analysts in these groups. So look out, everyone, for infiltrators from the ADL,
Yeah.
in JV, Jewish Voices for Peace, Jewish Voice for Peace, and Students for Justice in Palestine. Something that I think is so critical for people's understanding of Zionism and Israel is that, there's such a romanticized presentation that younger people are being spared to some extent, but some people still get it from family members, and some people are even well-meaning. They're just ignorant. They really think that Israel was created as an altruistic project, that the great powers felt guilt over the Holocaust, and they did this because they cared about the Jews. But of course, looking at the anti-Semitism that was also present in Zionism as a colonial project, it kind of disrupts that. But can you talk about that? Because I think it can be very eye-opening for people.
I would also talk about the anti-Semitism of the people who helped to create Israel.
Yeah,
I mean, we're talking about Lord Balfour.
right.
Lord Balfour, the author of the Balfour Declaration, which he issued on behalf of the British cabinet. Lord Balfour was the author, as the prime minister in 1905, or at least his government was the author of the most anti-Semitic legislation in Britain since the King of England, back in the 12th century, kicked all the Jews out of England for a whole century. And that was the Alien Exclusion Act of 1905, which prevented Jewish refugees from Tsarist persecution after the Kishinev pogrom and many, many other pogroms from entering Britain. His love for the Jewish people stopped at the shores of the British Isles, but it extended not so much to Palestine as to utilization of Zionism as a tool of British imperial interests. I mean, my first book was about how the British decided a decade before the Balfour Declaration, 12 years before the Balfour Declaration, in fact, that Palestine was essential strategically for a multitude of reasons to British imperial strategic concerns. That's why they issued the Balfour Declaration. It wasn't the brown eyes of the Jewish people who had been
As nice as
excluded
they are.
from England by Balfour himself when he had
Right.
been prime minister back in 1905. You can say the same thing about the United States voting for the partition of Palestine in 1947. The racist, exclusionary immigration laws that prevented hundreds of thousands of Jews who could have been saved from Europe in the 1930s were not changed, neither by President Roosevelt nor by President Truman. The pervasive anti-Semitism of American society in those years, redlining, exclusion from Ivy League universities, exclusion from country clubs, was a characteristic of American society. This is the society that voted for statehood, for a Jewish state in Palestine, not again out of any luck. Let them go over there. We don't want them here. Or if they're here, we will discriminate against them, and we won't let their relatives in. I think you have to examine not just, as you suggested, the ethnic and other aspects to Zionism and the way in which it related to the indigenous population of Palestine. You have to look at the motivations of the great powers, which supported this project, whether Great Britain up through World War II, or whether the United States thereafter.
And what are the present day imperial goals for the United States and for the West behind its support of Israel?
Right. It gets more complicated as you get closer and closer to the present, because I think the idea that Israel is an enormous strategic asset is one that was very easy to understand in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, especially during the Cold War, when if you were an American ally client able to defeat Soviet allies and clients, then you were an asset. I mean, in terms of the way in which the black and white way in which people saw things from Washington, and that's perfectly easy to understand. And then during the so-called global war on terror, Ariel Sharon succeeded in selling a bill of goods to the Bush administration, which was, of course, traumatized, as many Americans were, by 9/11, and sold them this bill of goods that terrorism is terrorism, and that what the Palestinians are doing is just like what Al-Qaeda does, and therefore what our means and our aims are the same as your means and your aims. And so again, that's seen as a strategic. The other thing is Israel is an enormously powerful country, and having that powerful country on the side of the United States has been seen in Washington, certainly for the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, as an enormous asset. I think that may be changing. I think it's beginning to be seen as more and more of an albatross, as Israel, by its own actions, makes itself into a pariah state, as Israel, by its own actions, alienates enormous parts of the world, and is no longer seen by regional powers as quite as intimidating and as powerful. as it was before October 7th. And so that may eventually change. But, these elites take a long time to change their views. You have a president whose ideas about the world were formed in the 60s and even maybe before that. And he's not going to change anytime soon. And you have a gerontocracy, which dominates our Senate and our House, and a foreign policy establishment who are like a bunch of lemmings. They all go in the same direction. They all believe the same things. There's a consensus that's almost unbreakable. And so you listen to a Steve Walt or a John Mearsheimer or other people who have differing views on Ukraine or on Russia or China. They're an infinitesimally small minority.
Right.
That's also true about Israel in the foreign policy establishment, as it is in the political establishment, as it is in the people who own and run our media. The young journalists of 20, 30, and 40 know better in many cases. The older 60, 70-year-old, 55, 65, 75-year-old people who own and manage and run the media, they have a worldview that's quite actually passé.
Now, why is it that Joe Biden can't get on the phone and do anything besides have apparently hard conversations with Netanyahu, but Ronald Reagan was able to do that with Menachem Begin during the
Actually,
Israel's war in Lebanon?
right. I mean, that's one of the best examples of an American president using the enormous power of the United States to treat a client state as if it's a client state. I mean, sometimes it looks today like the United States is a client state of Israel.
Yeah.
I mean, we see the same pap repeated out of the mouths of American officials that are being repeated by members of the Netanyahu government and their spokespersons. It's quite extraordinary. And there are other presidents who did this. President Bush the elder and Secretary of State Baker, Secretary of State Schultz. I can go on and on and on. President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, even President Johnson. These are presidents who in many cases were extremely pro-Israel. I mean, there's no question but that they saw Israel as a strategic ally, that they supported Israel, but they were able to separate their, those strategic and ideological commitments from the American national interest and say, this is harming us. And
Right.
we're willing to crack down on Israel. I could go the war of attrition in 1970, what Kissinger did to Israel, forcing them out of Sinai in the first and second Sinai disengagement agreements, and the Golan disengagement agreement. You read Kissinger's memoirs; he fought them tooth and nail, in their own interest, I would argue, to some extent, but mainly in the American national interest. And Israeli politicians were blind to that. Today, everybody sees this was the basis of a peace with Egypt, an enormous benefit to Israel, but they didn't want to do it. They were forced to do it. So I would argue that has happened again and again and again, actually, especially when vital American strategic interests, selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, for example, are at stake. They'll walk right all over Israel and have in the past. Now, this president is much more unwilling to do so. In some ways, I think he is the most committed Zionist in American history. I think more than Truman, more than Reagan, and all of them were, devoted to Israel in different ways. I think also he's surrounded by a clique of sycophants and weaklings, people who don't have the kind of personality that a Baker had, or a Schultz had, or a Kissinger had, where they would argue with their principal and say to the president, Mr. President, I don't agree with this. This is a mistake. And sometimes they would be listened to. That does not seem to be happening here. And I think that the damage that's being done to the American national interest, to the United States' standing in the world, not to speak of to Israel. I mean, I'm not speaking in Israel's interest, but Israel is
Coincidentally.
a whirlpool. I'm going to mix metaphors into a quagmire. And anybody with Israel's self-interest at heart, a self-professed Zionist like the president, would try to save them from themselves. He's not doing that. He's certainly not willing. He doesn't seem to be willing to do that. The last thing is, though, that there is a domestic element here. I think he's terrified of the Republicans, who are going to hold him to task for anything he does to restrain Israel. The Republican Party has a different political base than the Democratic Party to 2024. And there are a lot of people who are evangelical Christians. There are a lot of people who are devoted Zionists. There are a lot of people who believe in Israel right and wrong, and also believe that might is right. And they like Israel whacking people. For them, that's a good thing. States should whack people. Israel should whack people. That's to some extent the base of the Republican Party.
Yeah, Nikki Haley just signed a bomb that said "Finish him."
Right. Or in a more sophisticated way, listen to Lindsey Graham.
Sure.
That's the voice
Right,
of the
right, yeah.
Republican hawks who, believe in whatever Israel does is right. And I think the president is running scared of those people, much
Right,
more scared of them than he is of his own base,
right.
the people he should be listening to.